All right, listeners, so get the fuzz. We're diving into the world of forensic science today,
Oh, very cool.
and it's all thanks to you. You guys sent in so much incredible material.
It's a fascinating field for sure.
Seriously, I feel like I'm getting ready to be on one of those, what are they called? Those crime procedural shows? But, ready to, drop some serious knowledge bombs.
Yeah.
But one of the things that got me thinking right off the bat from all this material is this quote. Get this. An expert is someone knowing more and more about less and less, eventually knowing everything about nothing.
Oh, wow.
Right. And it's attributed to a famous forensic pathologist.
Interesting.
What do you think about that?
Well, it makes me think about, how specialized forensic science really is.
Yeah.
Because you have these experts, and each one really does know maybe everything about a tiny little thing.
Oh, I see what you mean.
It's almost like they had this one little puzzle piece.
And they know it inside and out.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And it's that level of detail that can make or break a whole case,
Oh, absolutely. And speaking of puzzles, I was blown away by all the different types of puzzles forensic science can actually tackle.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. I went into this thinking, fingerprints and DNA, the classics.
Right, the classic image.
Exactly. But we're talking teeth, bones, even bugs.
It's amazing what those things can tell you. I mean, take forensic entomology.
What's that?
It's where they use bugs to, figure stuff out.
Okay, now I'm both intrigued and kind of grossed out.
Well, for instance, they can actually figure out time of death just by looking at the insects on a decomposing body.
Wait, hold on. Are you serious? Bugs can tell you that?
It's incredible, right? It's all about insect life cycles.
Huh.
Yeah. Those things are like clockwork.
Like clockwork.
And using that knowledge and then factoring in stuff like the environment, temperature,
Okay.
they can determine what we call the post-mortem interval, or PMI.
The PMI. So bugs are basically like little timekeepers for,
In a way, yeah.
that's both fascinating and a little creepy, which I guess kind of comes with the territory when we're talking about forensic science. But speaking of fascinating and maybe a tad creepy, one of the articles you sent mentioned that you can actually determine someone's age just from their skeleton, just from their bones.
Oh, yeah, that's forensic anthropology.
Okay, but how accurate is that, really?
So it's not like, they can tell you someone's birthday by looking at their bones or anything like that.
Okay.
But it's more about narrowing down an age range. It's all about how bones grow and how they change over time, like how certain bones fuse together at certain ages, and even things like how much wear and tear there is on the joints.
Yeah.
That can give clues too.
So it's kind of like looking at a skeleton and saying, okay, this person, they were probably, let's say, between 25 and 30 years old when they died or something like that.
Yeah, exactly. It gives you a window, a range. It's not, an exact science.
Makes sense.
And anthropologists are, they're always very careful to point out the limitations.
Right, of course.
But it can be incredibly useful,
Yeah.
especially if you're dealing with, unidentified remains. It's a starting point.
That's really incredible when you think about it.
It is.
It's like they're reconstructing someone's life, or at least part of it, just from their bones. It's almost like archaeology meets detective work.
Yeah, and it goes beyond just bones, too. Forensic anthropologists, they also look at things like hair and fibers, even plant matter found on or near the body.
Really?
Yeah, all those things can tell you something
Wow.
about a person's life and how they,
Okay, now my mind is officially blown. I mean, a strand of hair, a random leaf. Who knew they could tell you so much?
It's really incredible. That's what I love about this field. It's all about those small details. Something that seems totally insignificant could end up being the key to the whole case.
It's like you're piecing together this giant puzzle.
Exactly.
And every little piece, even the ones that seem kind of random, they matter.
That's forensic science for you.
It's amazing, right? How, the smallest things can be so important in forensic science, like we were just talking about.
Absolutely, yeah.
And speaking of unexpected things being important, when I was looking through all the stuff you sent, I found this whole section on paint chip analysis. Paint chips.
Oh, yeah.
I'm trying to wrap my head around that.
It's pretty interesting, though, how much you can tell.
Really?
Oh, yeah. Paint chip analysis is actually really useful.
Okay, but, it's not like there's some massive database with, every color of paint ever made?
Not exactly.
So how does it work?
Well, you might be surprised how specific they can get with it.
Okay.
It's not just the color. They look at the chemical makeup, how many layers of paint there are, even the way it was applied.
Dude.
Yep. All of that can help link a paint chip back to where it came from.
Yeah.
We're talking a car, a building, even a piece of furniture.
Wait, so you're saying a tiny chip of paint could be like a fingerprint, basically?
In a way, yeah.
Like it could tie someone to a crime scene.
Exactly.
Wow, never would have thought of that.
Think about, like, hit-and-run accidents.
Oh, right.
Even the tiniest speck of paint on it, like victims' clothes, could help you track down the car involved.
Right.
Or, art forgeries, they use it for that too.
Really?
Yeah, they could analyze the layers of paint to see if it's the real deal or like a modern fake.
So crazy how much information can be hidden in something so small.
It really is. It
Mm.
really speaks to the level of expertise these forensic scientists have and the attention to detail.
Absolutely. It's kind of mind-blowing when you think about it.
It is. And, it makes you realize how interdisciplinary this field really is. I mean, we've talked about biology, entomology, but it's also chemistry, physics, engineering.
Yeah, it's like a whole bunch of different fields coming together.
Exactly.
It really is. All this talk about like how much goes into analyzing evidence, it made me think of something we mentioned before, the whole decline in autopsies being performed.
Oh, right. Yeah.
One of the articles mentioned it, and it was kind of concerning, to be honest. I mean, aren't autopsies important, like crucial for figuring things out?
Yeah, they are. They're incredibly important for solving crimes, obviously, but also for, like, our overall understanding of medicine.
I can see how it's important for crimes, but medicine.
Think about it. Every autopsy is a chance to learn more about how diseases work, how they affect the body.
Oh.
They can help us, like, even discover new medical conditions, and even improve surgical techniques.
Wow. Makes you look at it differently.
Right. Each autopsy is like this valuable learning opportunity.
So when fewer are done, we're losing all those insights. It's kind of a big deal.
Exactly. It just goes to show how important forensic science is beyond, just solving crimes.
Totally. It affects like everything.
It's all connected for sure.
Okay, but going back to like the crime solving stuff for a sec, we got to talk about bite mark analysis.
Oh, yeah.
We touched on it earlier, but one article made me wonder, like, how reliable is it really?
Yeah, it's definitely a tricky one. I mean, it has been really helpful in some cases, They've solved crimes using bite mark
I'm
analysis.
basing it on those crime shows.
Right, exactly. But there's a lot of debate about how accurate it really is, and how likely it is that they could get it wrong.
Oh, interesting. Why is that?
Well, for one thing, human skin, it's pretty elastic. So those bite marks can change shape over time. And then getting a clear impression, like a good one to analyze, it's not always easy. It's not like in the movies,
No.
right? It's not always so clear cut.
Exactly. So you have to be really careful about how you interpret it.
And it's important to have other evidence too, right?
Yeah.
Not just rely on the bite mark.
Definitely. You always want to look at everything together. It's not about finding that one magic piece of evidence.
It's more like putting together a puzzle.
Exactly.
And sometimes those pieces, well, they can be open to interpretation, right?
Yeah, for sure.
Huh, fascinating stuff.
It really makes you think about all the work that goes into like analyzing even the tiniest little piece of evidence, huh? Like we were talking about bugs, bones, even a chip of paint.
It's incredible, isn't it, how much information they can get from that stuff?
It really is. And what's so interesting to me? It's like forensic science, it's not about having all the answers right away, It's more about like asking the right questions and then really taking the time to look at everything closely.
It's a puzzle, right?
Totally. You got to piece it all together, one little detail at a time. I mean, we've barely even scratched the surface today. Like, we talked about paint chips and bite marks, but there's so much more to it than that.
Oh, absolutely.
What is it? Ballistics, digital forensics. There's even forensic accounting.
It's a huge field, yeah.
Yeah. It really is. Like, every time you think you've got a handle on it, bam, there's a whole other layer.
And it's always changing, too.
Yeah.
I mean, think about all the new technology, new ways of doing things.
Exactly. Makes you wonder, like, what will they be able to do in the future? What kind of mysteries will they be able to solve? Science.
Should be fascinating.
Absolutely. Our listener is particularly interested in fundamentals of forensic science, and they want to go beyond the TV dramas.
Ah, so they want the real deal, huh?
Yeah.
Getting down to the nitty-gritty of evidence and analysis.
Exactly. No fancy Hollywood embellishments here, just good old-fashioned scientific principles applied to crime solving.
Love it. It's like detective work, but instead of magnifying glasses, we have test tubes and DNA sequencers.
That's a great way to put it. So let's start with the basics. The book defines forensic science as the science of associating people, places, and things involved in criminal activities.
Right to the point.
But then it hits us with a curveball. It says forensic science is history. History? I thought we were talking about science.
Well, think about it this way. Forensic science is all about piecing together the events of the past, right? Just like a historian uses documents and artifacts, we use evidence left at a crime scene to reconstruct what happened.
Okay, that makes sense. So we're basically time travelers using science to rewind the clock and put together the pieces of a puzzle.
Precisely. But instead of looking for pieces of pottery or ancient scrolls, we're looking for fingerprints, DNA, fibers, and any other traces that can tell us who was there and what they did.
So we're talking about those tiny, often invisible clues that criminals leave behind, even if I don't realize it.
Exactly. And that's where the principles of transfer and persistence come in. These are absolutely crucial for any forensic investigator.
Okay, let's break those down. Transfer, I'm guessing, refers to how evidence, well, transfers from one place to another.
You got it. Every time there's contact between two things, there's a potential for something to be left behind. Like, imagine a suspect wearing a wool sweater breaks into a house. Even if they're careful, tiny fibers from that sweater can snag on a broken window pane. That's transfer in action.
And those fibers become a potential link between the suspect and the crime scene.
Exactly. It's like leaving a calling card, even if you didn't mean to.
And persistence is about how long that calling card, that evidence, sticks around.
Exactly. Now, those wool fibers, they could stay on that window for days, weeks, maybe even longer, depending on things like weather, cleaning, environmental factors.
So even the smallest, seemingly insignificant trace can be a goldmine for investigators if it sticks around long enough to be found.
Absolutely. Remember that case with Wayne Williams?
Vaguely. Remind me.
He was convicted back in the 80s, and tiny fibers found on the victims were a big part of it. Linked him to the crimes.
Wow. So even something as tiny as a fiber can be a smoking gun.
That's the thing about forensic science. It's often the tiniest details that speak volumes. But it's not just about what you find, it's about understanding what it means in the context of the crime.
Context. That's crucial, isn't it? I mean, finding a fingerprint at a crime scene might seem like a huge break, but what if that person worked there or lived there? Suddenly, that fingerprint isn't so incriminating.
Exactly. Context is everything in forensic science. Let's say, for instance, you find dog hairs at a crime scene. Could be a big lead, right? Unless, of course, the crime happened in a dog park, then it's just, well, normal.
So we need to look at the whole picture, the entire crime scene, to accurately interpret any single piece of evidence.
Absolutely. And that brings us to crime scene investigation, which the book aptly calls the center of the forensic world.
It sounds like investigators are under immense pressure to get it right. You're telling me it's like walking a tightrope, one wrong step, and the whole case could fall apart.
It's true. The book uses the phrase one-way street to describe it. Crime scene processing, that is.
Because you only get one shot to get it right.
Exactly. Once a scene's been contaminated, you can't exactly uncontaminate it, and that's why the chain of custody is so important.
Right, because we can't just be tossing evidence around like a frisbee.
Yeah.
What is the chain of custody exactly?
It's all about documentation. From the moment something is identified as potential evidence, every single person who handles it, even for a second, needs to be documented. Think of it as a really detailed receipt for every interaction to ensure that nothing gets lost or tampered with. And it's not even just about preventing deliberate tampering, though that's obviously a huge part of it.
It's also about making sure that nobody accidentally invalidates evidence by mishandling it.
Exactly. And technology is really changing the game there. The book mentioned barcodes for tracking evidence.
Like at the grocery store?
Well, sort of. Every piece of evidence gets a unique barcode, and every time it's moved or analyzed, that information is logged. So you've got a digital trail for every single piece of evidence. Really helps maintain that chain of custody.
Wow, that's pretty impressive. Adds a whole other level of, well, accountability, I guess.
Absolutely. But it's not just about the fancy gadgets and databases. The book actually talks about some of the dangers CSIs face on the job.
Dangers. I always pictured CSI work as being mostly in, those pristine labs.
It's definitely not all test tubes and microscopes. Crime scenes can be unpredictable. We might encounter sharp objects, biohazards like blood, even toxic chemicals from time to time. So safety has to be the #1 priority.
Right. You never know what you might encounter out there.
Exactly. CSIs need to be prepared for anything.
Speaking of needing to be prepared, the book mentions something I found interesting. That even seemingly identical items can have unique characteristics. They say that no two objects are absolutely identical and use mass-produced items as an example. How can they tell the difference between two things that, even a factory would consider identical?
That's where the real detective work comes in, examining those tiny details that differentiate one thing from another. Take two white tennis shoes, for example. To the naked eye, they're indistinguishable, but a trained forensic examiner would look for microscopic differences.
Like, what, a scuff mark or something?
It could be anything,
Yeah.
a tiny scuff mark, a slight variation in the stitching, even the wear pattern on the soles. It's all about those individualizing characteristics that set one object apart from another.
So you're looking for the, I don't know, the fingerprint of a tennis shoe.
Exactly. And these individual characteristics, when combined with other evidence, can be used to link an object back to a specific source, like a suspect.
It's amazing how even the smallest detail can make a difference. But I imagine proving that something is unique is, well, it's got to be pretty challenging sometimes, right?
It definitely can be. And that's because, as the book mentions, forensic science is often more casework-driven than research-driven.
So you're saying there isn't always like a scientific study to back up every single piece of evidence.
Exactly. A lot of the knowledge in forensic science comes from years of experience, examining evidence in countless cases, and building up a body of knowledge.
So it's about applying those scientific principles in the real world, using both the hard data and the experience of the investigators.
Precisely.
So how do investigators actually go about analyzing all this stuff? The book talks about microscopy as being a cornerstone, even saying good criminalistic technique demands the effective use of the microscope.
Oh, microscopy is crucial. It allows us to see the world in a whole new way, revealing details that are invisible to the naked eye.
Give us an example. What kind of things can you see with a microscope that you wouldn't be able to see otherwise?
Imagine trying to tell the difference between cotton and rayon fibers. They might look and even feel very similar, but under a microscope, their structures are totally different.
Interesting. So even fibers, which you might not even notice at a crime scene, can hold valuable clues when viewed under a microscope.
Absolutely. And we're not just talking about one type of microscope either. There are many different types, each with its own strengths. There's light microscopy, polarized light microscopy to examine things like crystals and fibers, and even electron microscopy, which allows us to see things at the nanoscale.
It sounds like forensic scientists have a whole arsenal of tools at their disposal.
We do. And microscopy is just the tip of the iceberg. The book also talks about techniques like spectroscopy.
Spectroscopy. That sounds familiar from, like, chemistry class.
Exactly. It's all about analyzing how light interacts with different materials. We can use it to identify substances based on their unique spectral signatures.
So like a fingerprint, but for materials.
Got it. We can analyze things like paint chips or fibers using spectroscopy. Each material absorbs and reflects light in its own way, creating a unique pattern.
So you can analyze a speck of paint found on a suspect's clothing and potentially match it back to the paint used on a getaway car, for example.
Exactly. It's really powerful stuff.
It's incredible how much information can be gleaned from, well, seemingly nothing. The book also delves into chromatography, particularly its use in drug analysis.
Ah, chromatography. That's a cornerstone of forensic toxicology. Let us separate a complex mixture into its individual components.
So if you find, say, a white powder at a crime scene, chromatography could help you determine whether it's cocaine, heroin, or just, baking soda.
Precisely.
Yeah.
It's like a high-tech sieve, separating the different parts of a mixture so they can be analyzed individually.
So we've got microscopy, spectroscopy, chromatography. It seems like so many different scientific disciplines come together in forensic science.
They do. It's a truly interdisciplinary field. And of course, no discussion of forensic science would be complete without mentioning DNA analysis.
Right. The book actually highlights a really interesting case, the Colin Pitchfork case.
Oh, that was a landmark case. It really revolutionized forensic science.
It was one of the first cases to use DNA evidence, wasn't it?
It was. In 1983, a young woman was murdered in England, and the police had very little to go on. But they were able to use DNA evidence to eventually identify Colin Pitchfork as the perpetrator.
So DNA was like the missing piece of the puzzle.
Exactly. And that case really demonstrated the incredible power of DNA to identify individuals with remarkable accuracy. Today, it's considered the gold standard in forensic science.
It's like having a unique identifier for every person on the planet. But DNA evidence isn't foolproof, is it? I mean, there's still the issue of contamination or even the potential for evidence to be planted.
You're absolutely right. Just because someone's DNA is found at a crime scene doesn't automatically make them guilty. We still have to look at the whole picture, the context of the crime, and determine how and when that DNA got there.
So it always comes back to context. We can't just rely on a single piece of evidence, no matter how compelling it might seem.
Exactly. Forensic science is about building a case, brick by brick, using all the tools and information at our disposal.
It's like a giant puzzle. And each piece of evidence, each test result, brings us closer to seeing the complete picture.
That's a great way to put it. And sometimes those pieces can be incredibly small, like the anisotropic nature of certain materials.
Anisotropic, that's a new one. What does that even mean? Anisotropic, that's a new one. What does that even mean?
It's simpler than it sounds. It just means that a material's properties can be different depending on the direction you look at it, like wood. It's easier to split it with the grain than against it, right?
Yeah, that makes sense. But how does that relate to forensic science?
Well, imagine a shattered piece of glass from a hit and run. If it's anisotropic, how much it bends light could be different depending on which way you're looking at it.
So you're saying the same piece of glass could give you different results if it's not analyzed from the right angle.
Exactly. It's just another thing for forensic scientists to keep in mind when they're analyzing evidence. They need to think about all the angles, literally.
It's amazing how even the smallest detail, like how light passes through something, can have a huge impact on a forensic investigation. We've covered so much in this deep dive, from the very basics of forensic science to those meticulous crime scene investigations, all these incredible tools and techniques.
It's like putting together a giant puzzle, isn't it? Using science to figure out what happened, who was there.
It really is. And it all comes back to that idea that every contact leaves a trace. It might be tiny, it might be hidden, but with the right tools and expertise, those traces can tell a story.
Exactly. And that's what forensic science is all about, isn't it? Using science to tell the story of a crime.
Well said. It's been fascinating to explore the world of forensic science, and we hope you've enjoyed this deep dive, listener. Just maybe you'll be the one uncovering those hidden clues and cracking the case.